Joining us now on the Emerald Queen Casino Sportsbook Hotline. She was calling for Mike Macdonald to be the new head coach of the Seahawks and got her wish. It's ESPN's Mina Kimes. Mina, how are you feeling about this new hire?
This was my choice before anyone was hired, and obviously Seattle was kind of pretty late in the game with only one opening left. So to see it work out this way, honestly, I'm shocked. I didn't think it would go this way in Seattle's favor, and I think it's a very pleasant surprise.
Yeah, we love it here too, Mina. And the first thing people do is kind of pick apart what he's not, right? I feel like it's all the haters in Baltimore who are mad their DC are leaving. They're picking apart all the things he isn't. But when you look at his coaching profile and his style, what are some things that stick out to you?
There's a few things. I mean, we'll start with the on the field, the schematic aspect of it, which is, I think, what really jumps out, and I'm not the first person to say this, but in a division where you're playing Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay's offenses twice a year, and we've seen, the Seattle defense struggle versus those offenses. It feels like year after year lately. To bring in a coach who has been so successful against those teams and teams with similar approaches on offense, like the Texans, the Dolphins, the Lions, there's some similarities there. The 49ers, obviously. That's so important, and it gives you hope, frankly, that this defense can get turned around. It's a fantastic scheme. It's one of my favorites to watch in the NFL, the complexity of what they do with their coverage rotations and their simulated pressure, something we talk about a lot on NFL Live. And it's really something you have to do in the modern NFL. And I also add that Seattle has tried some of those things, just over the last couple of years, but they haven't executed on them. And I think the hope is that, he can, whether it's the existing personnel or bringing in new players, whether they can improve on the execution side. And I think that's the other thing that I would highlight here that I think is so noteworthy. It's not just X's and O's and clever scheme stuff. It is the fact that he seems to have gotten the most out of so many players at different points in their careers. Obviously, young stars like Kyle Hamilton, who's emerged as one of the best safeties in the NFL. Patrick Queen really developing underneath him at inside linebacker, free agent, by the way, someone to keep an eye on. But also veterans, guys like Kyle Van Noy, Jadeveon Clowney, Michael Pierce up front, all having career years in Baltimore. That, to me, stands out because the number one thing you want out of a head coach is someone who can get the most out of their players.
Well, and it's especially important when you're already not getting the most out of your players because, Mina, I'm sure you would agree, though I don't want to put words in your mouth, that Seattle's defensive talent was greater than their performance on the field. It's not like they don't have anyone out there, right?
Yeah, it's totally. It's not like, I don't know, I think about watching the Eagles at the end where certainly there were issues with the scheme and some of the approaches they took, game planning, but there were so many holes on that defense. And then you look at Seattle and, you could single out pass rush after Chinonwosu went down. Obviously, they have invested a fair amount of draft capital and trades up front, but there is talent at all three levels. And yet it felt like, especially in recent years, they were underperforming relative to that talent for whatever reason. Maybe it's the wrong personnel for what they wanted to run. Injuries certainly played a role. But I think the hope is that, you can take a lot of the players who are already on the roster and that they can go to another level, next year.
Mina, Stacey and I had this conversation. We'd love to get your perspective on it. Macdonald hasn't played football. He didn't play football, but he can coach the heck out of football. What are some of the advantages of a guy that's 36 years old? He's young, hasn't played the game. What advantages does he bring looking at the game from the angle he does by, simply not playing the game?
Yeah, I've talked to players who have played for him, guys in Baltimore, and I think the brains jump out, the teaching aspect of it, someone who sees the game in such a sort of elevated way, and the modernity of the scheme, the way they dictate to offenses, which is sort of, so important in today's NFL. But, I think sometimes with youth and I've only heard great things about coach interpersonally, there can also be some humility. I think back to Sean McVay when he was hired by the Rams. And there were a lot of question marks around that at the time. You guys remember it was about He was actually younger, but and one thing he did that I thought was so smart was he brought in Wade Phillips to coach defense and said, "Hey, you got defense. Let's do that at first." And I think that sort of is something that would benefit Macdonald as well offensively. That's a hire that still has to be made. But if he can find someone he can trust and sort of enlist him to handle that side of the ball so that he doesn't feel like there's too much responsibility in year one, I think that would be very helpful.
You know, I wanted to lean into your X's and O's knowledge as an analyst just a bit for this answer, Mina. I think that it's very natural to look at the way the league is evolving offensively and go, oh, find your Sean McVay, find your Kyle Shanahan. And anytime I listen to podcasts and NFL podcasts, including yours, which we love, there is obviously a focus on the way the offenses are evolving. But it feels like maybe especially this year, there was a focus on some really innovative defenses. Is that something that kind of caught your attention with Macdonald as well?
Absolutely. And you really saw defense kind of strike back this year.
Yeah.
And I think that really manifested itself a few times in the playoffs. By the way, of course, Macdonald shutting out Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes' offense in the second half of that game was pretty remarkable. But, yeah, the defensive evolution is kind of ongoing. And I wouldn't say there's like an overwhelming kind of meta. Like, it's not like everyone's running the same stuff the way we were talking about guys embracing the Fangio system a couple of years ago after the Rams won the Super Bowl. But the one thing you do notice with all the really great defenses is creativity. And this is something, by the way, that both Spagnuolo and Macdonald have in common. The defenses, there's a lot that differentiates them, especially how they approach pressure. But the thing that they have in common is they're both constantly confusing quarterbacks, where that pressure is coming from, if it's coming at all. And then the execution and coverage in conjunction with that is so notable and obvious. So I think having a defensive coach, it is interesting, guys, looking around the league. And you remember just a few years ago, it felt like if you were an offensive coach, a friend of McVay, right?
Right.
That was your first path to getting a head coaching job. And we are seeing a lot of defensive hires, and I think that has something to do with it.
Staying on the defensive side, yeah, you mentioned Queen, who is a free agent this year. I look at Jordan Brooks, and I think he would go perfectly into what Mike Macdonald wants to do. Do you agree or disagree with that?
No, I totally agree. Jordan, I think, is such an underrated player. You've really seen him, I think, develop mentally in terms of his ability to diagnose coverages, read quarterbacks. And, it's very hard to play inside linebacker in the NFL these days, and it takes a second. With him, it's always just been, to me, or at least it's been the last couple of years, just a matter of health. And I think if he was healthy, and I believe he is going to be next year, I'd be all for Seattle keeping him. And I think there'd be a lot of appeal from Macdonald, but because that's a position they really have to nail. It's so important to his scheme. Obviously, in Baltimore, you have arguably the best linebacker in tandem in the league this year. So that's something that I imagine they'll prioritize.
I know this isn't directly related to the head coach, but you bring in a defensive guy, especially a brilliant defensive guy, and you start thinking, oh, what if we can, try this with Jamal Adams one more time? Obviously, his cap hit is only going to increase, and he had injuries this year, kind of some weird off the field, tension. Do you look at it as, hey, here's a chance to really take advantage and make this trade work? Or, hey, love the hire of Macdonald, but I do think it's still time to move on from Adams?
You guys would know better than I I haven't looked at his contract, sort of what the status is in terms of moving on from him. But just as a player, I do think that there's a lot that Macdonald could do with him. I think there's a lot that the existing coaches wanted to do with him, conversations I had over the years, and because of health, they just weren't able to. And again, similar to Brooks, I do think questions of health will probably factor into that decision going forward, because if they move on, that's another position that they'll have to address, whether in the draft or free agency.
Yeah, I don't know about post June 1st, but right now it would be only $6 million in cap savings, though the first year you'd have cap savings. So it's tough.
Mina, do you think it was how difficult was this decision for Macdonald? I mean, you stay. We saw him kind of Ben Johnson set the tone, like, look, I'm going to stay. And then Slowick says, look, I'm going to stay too. You look at the Ravens and say you have an MVP type quarterback. You got health in the tight end room now. You got some weapons on the outside. Then you look at the Commanders in Seattle. Was this a difficult decision?
I think what's tricky, guys, is you with the coaches who do stay, like Ben Johnson, you never really know what the decision was, right? Like, you never know. Well, did they actually walk away from a job? Was
Right.
it a sure thing? What were the terms of it? There's a lot of smoke this time of year, frankly. So it can be hard to read because generally my feeling is with, just coordinators and ones I've talked to over the years, when the opportunities come up, you usually take them because there's no guarantee they'll come up again. And I'll say this about, Macdonald coming here. Seattle's a good job. I thought the Commander's job actually had some appeal as well because it's more of like a blank slate. But Seattle, to me, is a team where there's already a lot of talent on the roster. You have a quarterback I think is good. You're set at that position, in my opinion, Geno Smith. And then, as we've been discussing, there are talented players on defense. So, you can always wait and say maybe we'll get to the Super Bowl, but it's really hard to get back to the Super Bowl as well, or to get to the Super Bowl, pardon me, in the case of Baltimore. So I'm not surprised that he took a job, and I'm obviously thrilled that it was Seattle.
You were asking for this one a while back, called it a while back, and you finally got your wish. Mina, so did we. We're so happy about it, and we're happy to have you on to help us understand a bit more the X's and O's behind why you love Macdonald so much as a candidate. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mina.
Thanks for having me, guys.